All right, good morning, folks. Welcome, everyone, to the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC Lunchtime Webinar Series, September 2016 edition. My name is Ben Kaler, and I'm the Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. The Gulf Coast Prairie LCC is a collaborative science support partnership working to deliver sustainable natural and cultural resource conservation in the Gulf Coast Prairie geography by sharing scientific knowledge, leveraging resources, and working toward a common landscape goal. The LCC chose 28 focal species that represent 17 broadly defined habitats in order to define and design long-term landscape conservation to achieve the mission of the partnership. And in August 2014, the steering committee approved our LCC science strategy, which identified the most critical science needs for 6 of these focal species. One of those top-tier focal species is Northern Bobwhite, and it was chosen to represent several grassland and shrubland habitats. Today, we're joined by Dr. Lenny Brennan and Dr. Umberto Proto-Valdivieso with Texas A&M University at Kingsville's Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Center. In just a moment, they'll talk to us about a project that we funded to address the greatest science need for Northern Bobwhite in the GCP. Before they take the floor, I would like to briefly introduce each of them. Dr. Brennan is a professor in the Department of Animal, Rangeland, and Wildlife Sciences at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. He also holds the C.C. Wynn Endowed Chair in the Richard M. Kleberg Jr. Center for Quail Research. Dr. Brennan's primary research interests pertain to habitat and population ecology of wild quail in Texas and developing a scientific basis for their management and conservation. He is conducting specific research projects on impacts of invasive exotic grasses, various brush management, and grassland habitat restoration techniques, relationships between habitat structure and quail population productivity, understanding the predator context in which quail nest in South Texas, as well as the genetic ecology of bobwhites across the Texas landscape and their geographic range. Dr. Brennan has authored or co-authored more than 170 scientific articles and more than 100 extension publications. He's received a Lifetime Sportsman Award by the Greater Houston chapter of the Quail Coalition in August 2013, and he was recently named a fellow by the Wildlife Society. Dr. Brennan has served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Wildlife Management and Wildlife Society Bulletin, and has also served terms as associate editor for the Journal of Wildlife Management, Wildlife Society Bulletin, and consulting editor for Wildlife Monographs. The National Bobwhite Technical Committee honored Dr. Brennan with its award for individual achievement at its annual meeting in Lincoln, Nebraska recently. The award is presented to recognize an individual's overall contributions to bobwhite research and or management during a career. NBTC cited him specifically for his positive national influence on quail management and his support of NBTC and the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative within the wildlife profession during his 33-year young career. Finally, Dr. Brennan was a central figure in the South Texas region's designation as the first ever NBCI legacy landscape for Northern Bobwhite conservation. Dr. Proto-Valdivieso was born and raised in La Paz, Bolivia. He graduated from the Universidad Mayor de San Simón in Cochabamba, Bolivia. He was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship in 1998 to come to the United States, where he obtained a Master's of Science in Forestry and a PhD in Rangeland Ecology and Management from Texas A&M University. Dr. Proto-Valdivieso is an assistant professor in landscape ecology at Texas A&M Kingsville at the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. His interests are landscape ecology, biodiversity, and bioinformatics. His research focuses on the role of spatial patterns and processes as related to ecosystem functions and ecosystem services at multiple scales, and the development of data infrastructure for the distribution of spatial data in the areas of conservation and management of natural resources. Dr. Proto-Valdivieso's research focuses on improving the understanding of how processes like human activities or grazing behavior interact with spatial patterns like vegetation, soils, and land use, and consequently how those affect ecosystem function. So without further ado, Dr. Brennan and Dr. Proto-Valdivieso, we welcome you. You have control of the webinar, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ben, for that great introduction. This is Lenny Brennan. I'm going to make a couple of background comments of how we got to where we are today with this project, and then Umberto is going to walk us through the panels in the PowerPoint presentation. For many, many years, we've known, strongly suspected, and known at least qualitatively that, habitat fragmentation has been a major factor influencing the negative downward trends of bobwhite populations throughout most of their range. I emphasize qualitatively because what we've been able to do here with the support of the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC is to quantify those relationships. And so I think it was back in 2014, I believe, that the request for statement of interest went out about doing a habitat fragmentation study on bobwhites. And at that point, I talked to Doctors Fidel Hernandez and Eric Brahman, who are faculty here with us at the Institute. And I also knew that we were bringing in Umberto soon as a new landscape ecologist with us. We had never had somebody on our faculty with professional expertise in landscape ecology. And so I knew that this would be a natural project for Umberto to work with us as a co-PI, given the skills that he brings to the table. So we wrote the statement of interest and then a full proposal and got the funding, and about the time that the funding came on, we hired Catherine Miller as a postdoc to basically organize the project and do the analyses. And then along the way, Umberto also brought in Jose Mata, Heather, Jacqueline, Zena, as well as Ben Wu and Marcus Peterson. So put together quite an interesting and diverse team of people to tackle this project, and it really is the first project to quantify the relationship between fragmentation of habitat and bobwhite population trends across a very broad geographic area, which turns out to be the state of Texas, the state of Oklahoma, and the state of Louisiana, which encompasses the entire geographic range of the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. So with that as a background, I'm going to ask Umberto to walk us through these results and what they mean, and then I believe we can answer questions at the completion of that.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much, Lenny, and thank you very much, everyone at the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative for this opportunity. And I'll go and start with the presentation. There are three factors that seem to be responsible for the long-term declines in northern bobwhites. One is urbanization. The second one is the intensification of agriculture and forestry practice, and the third one is exotic plants. Now, the data suggests from the breeding bird surveys shows that from the 1970s there has been a steady decline in bobwhite abundance. Overall is minus 4.08% of 4.08%. You can see the trends that are slightly different from Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Louisiana having the highest declines overall in the study area. And so one of the questions was, how do we address this fragmentation, and what are kind of the drivers at different scales? We know, and we have a very strong conceptual understanding of how northern bobwhites are affected by changes in the structure of vegetation. So as habitat patches become smaller and more isolated, there is a lower probability of persistence that could result in local extinction. So we know that's a good understanding. However, as we scale up things, we know less. We know less about what are the mechanisms of that habitat fragmentation. And what we need to do is get some empirical and quantifiable information that can help us understand the relationship between population trajectories and the factors that are affecting those trajectories, in other words, fragmentation. Now, one way to approach this is to use the model that was presented by Whitley in 2010. Patterns and scale are fundamental in ecology, so we'd like to see this as more of having domains of scale. So, you know, fragmentation that will affect the range distribution, factors that will affect the metapopulation, and factors that will affect individuals. And depending on the scale at which we are observing things, we are going to find different things happening there. And the purpose of this presentation, in a way, is to kind of identify these three domains and see what are the drivers that could explain bobwhite declines, both temporally and spatially. So the study area is the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative Area that focuses on Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. And what we're going to show you is some of the trends that have been happening in the last 4 decades. Now, the approach that we took is a 3-scale approach, a quantitative 3-scale approach. We have a region-wide analysis, a county-level analysis, and a home range analysis. The region-wide is for the distribution in those 3 states. The county level is has more to do with a metapopulation kind of level, and then we have the home range analysis. For the metapopulation level, we looked at areas that were required to have a 95% persistence. That was published by Sands and others in 2012, and they came with 3 numbers: 800 hectares as the minimum, 5,000 hectares as the average, and 9,600 hectares at the max. Catherine did some research on home ranges and values for home ranges, and she came with this number of 15 hectares that would be a reasonable number to assess landscape structure for bobwhite at the home range level. So I'm going to explain a little bit how we did the kind of things that we did at the region-wide analysis. First thing is that we used the breeding bird survey from 1970 to 2014. We used a number of interpolation techniques. In some cases, we used inverse distance weighted analysis. In some cases, we used kriging. We chose either or analysis depending on the accuracy of the estimates that we were getting there. Once that data was interpolated, we used data from, so we did that for every individual year based on the breeding bird survey. So, and what we did next is that we did a 5-year moving average. In other words, we grabbed the data from 1970, 71, 72, 73, 74. We averaged that, and that was our average for 1972. Next, we did 71 through 75, and that was the average, and then the average was for 1973. The reason to do that is that populations tend to have a lot of variability, if we use individual years, and this was kind of a smoothing technique to kind of show the trends that were happening, that we would be using across years from 1970 to 2014. The other data sets that we used was road density. We got road density data for 2000 and 2010. That road density includes roads, highways, bike trails, footpaths, and we have that in a raster database that is 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, and the road density was measured of number of meters for those 4 kilometers. We also have the human population growth based on the U.S. Census, and we had the data for 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. The way we analyze the census data is that we did an interpolation from the centroid of the county for all the counties that were involved in the study area. We also used land use data, the census of agriculture. We used 1974, 1978, 1987, 97, 2002, and 2012. The data from 1978 to 1997 was from the dissertation of Zeynep Okay. She did a long-term analysis that goes from probably the 1930s all the way to 1997. So in a way, this is a great collaboration because on one hand, we were working with her to update her databases so she could conduct this whole eastern U.S. Wide assessment, and we used her data and we clipped her database to be able to use the GCP LCC study area data. So what we did with that is we calculated the total amount of pasture land, woodland, cropland, and other land uses. We looked at the conservation research program, and again, we did a very similar procedure as what we did with the population. We used a county centroid, and all the databases were standardized to 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers for the region-wide study. To sample our data and look at trends, what we did is we took 4 sets of 100 random points. They had to be at least 40 kilometers apart, and the objective of that is to have as data as independent as possible. We tried to reduce autocorrelation as much as we could, and we did that for Northern Bobwhite populations, for land use, human population, and road density. Now, here are some maps that show the trends. Notice that the darker red areas are going to be areas that have higher numbers of Bobwhites, and you can see the data from 1970, 80, 90, 2000, and 2010. And the map in the blues and red show the changes. And as you can see, from 1970 to 2012, most of the area has seen a decline. Sharpest decline seems to be in South Texas. And then, interestingly enough, if you look, that darker blue area seems to follow the Houston, San Antonio, Dallas kind of I-35 path or highway. Okay. This is the trends in Bobwhite. So we had 4 sets of 100 points each, and we ran the regressions to see what kind of trends we would be seeing in Northern Bobwhites. And this is really interesting. There are 2 things. The 4 regressions are quite similar. They are both between 0.8, 0.9 in the slope, which means 0.8, 0.9 birds per year as a general trend. The other thing that's really interesting is that the R's are pretty high. The R squares are pretty high. And if you see the data from in the 1970s, there is a lot of variability. Now, and that variability and that huge error bar that you have there shows that there is, across the landscape, across the region, there are areas with a lot of Bobwhites and areas with little Bobwhites, and that spatial variability might indicate a good, resilient kind of population. If you go and start looking at the data in 2012, you will see that that variability has decreased significantly from the 1970s, which would indicate that there's probably less resilient populations across the range distribution. We looked at road density and Northern Bobwhite abundance. The triangles show the data, the road density from 2000. The road density, the circles show the road density from 2010. You can see road density has gone from an average probably 6,000 meters per 4 square kilometers to 9,000. So a third, an increase by a third between 2000 and 2010, and numbers have gone down, and you can see those very clear clusters between 2000 and 2010. Same idea with the population, human population per hectare. you can see that the 1970s, 1980s, there's a cluster there of data, 1990s, a second cluster, and then with 2000 and 2010, you can see that there has been a sharp decline in terms of bobwhite abundance. Now, in terms of land cover, you can see this is the data from the census 1974 for pasture, and then 2012. And one thing that we see is that there has been an increase in pasture, but there has been a decline in bobwhite. And there is a good reason for that. Potentially, it's not so much in the amount of pasture, but on the type of pasture. Improved grasses, the use of chemicals in agriculture around these areas may have had an impact on the decline. So again, having native pastures is going to be quite important for bobwhite. These improved pastures are monocultures usually, and they will have an impact on the presence of bobwhite in those areas. We looked at the amount of woodland across the region as well, and what we found is that there is a very distinctive cluster in 1974, 1978, 1987, and then 97, 2002, and 2012. And Lenny, can you see in here, there was a program, a US program in the 80s that started that would have that had an impact. We had this discussion.
Oh, the CRP?
The CRP.
And the CRP Farm Bill, and yes, in the context of the Farm Bill, where a lot of highly erodible cropland was planted to high-density loblolly pine. Loblolly pine at 700, 800 seedlings per acre.
So you can see that there are these two clusters, and again, a clear difference between the data before 1990s and after, and then in 97, 2000, and 2012. Cropland. You can see there has been a decrease in the amount of cropland. What's really interesting is that despite the decrease in cropland, there has been a decrease in bobwhite. And again, two factors. It could be that the reduction in cropland area could be due to urbanization, which could affect bobwhites, but also the use of chemicals, the use of improved products for agricultural production may have had also an effect on northern bobwhite abundance. So I'm going to move now into the county level analysis. For the county selection, what we did is we looked at the counties that had the greatest declines in bobwhite on average, and here are the counties for Louisiana. And Louisiana, what we saw is that pretty much everything was declining. Oklahoma, we found that there were 3 counties where we could consider that the decline wasn't that great. Actually, there were some positive numbers in Grant and Roger Mills, and then Grady, Love, and Osage showed a decline. And then in Texas, we had Donley, Frio, and Refugio as stable counties, or counties where population had increased a little bit, and then Eras, Fisher, and Jim Hogg as counties where populations had declined. We, for each county, we put 10 random points. Distance between them had to be at least 8 kilometers. We chose, again, those we created 3 buffers, 800 hectares, 5,000 hectares, and 9,600 hectares. We used Landsat 8. With Landsat 8, we classify the imagery for each county, taking into account the land uses from the U.S. Agriculture Census. You can see the 9,600 hectares, the 5,000 hectare, and the 800 hectare plots, and we also use road density. Now, the idea is that we calculated road density, percent land, mean patch area, largest patch index, patch density, and utility and nearest neighbor. These metrics, so percent land, mean patch area, largest patch index, patch density, and the nearest neighbor distance, are very good to kind of describe the difference between the spatial structure in patches. So, for example, if you look at the figure on the top, the green one being woody cover, you will see that they have a smaller mean patch area. The average patch size of this woody cover is going to be smaller. There will be a higher patch density, and the distance between these patches will be higher. And the overall percent land will be lower. So that shows a more fragmented kind of landscape, whereas the one at the bottom has two nice big patches of woody cover. The distance between the two patches is quite small, low patch density, high mean patch area. So when we compare, these two, what we use is these metrics to tell a story in terms of a quantitative way for that. And this is the growth density for the declining and the stable counties. A lot of variability across counties, but when we look at the overall, we can see that the declining counties have a higher growth density than the stable counties. So growth density might play a role in how it affects populations of Northern Bobwhite. The other thing that's really interesting is that this figure shows the maximum, the average, and minimum buffer areas that we use. And if you look at the results, they seem pretty similar across the three sizes, which led us to think that probably the maximum, the average, and the minimum areas for the population persistence are located within this domain 2, and the results are quite similar because we are working at the same scale. The size of the buffer is different, but the pattern that we are seeing is still at the same scale, and that's why we're not seeing much of a change in these results. So having said that, we looked at the percent land, the mean patch area, the largest patch index. These are all landscape metrics, patch density, edge density, and nearest neighbor. And what we found is that the areas that are declining have smaller mean patch areas, smaller largest patch indices, and a higher patch density. So they seem to be a little bit more fragmented, and the amount of woody cover seems to be lower as well in these declining areas. For pasture, we see different trends. So higher amounts of percent wood of pasture, larger mean patch areas, and higher patch density, higher edge density, and not much difference in the Euclidean nearest neighbor distance. And the two significant areas are the percent of woody cover and the edge density. In terms of cropland, similar patterns as in terms of pasture, higher percent of cropland in terms of area, higher mean patch area, which means bigger cropland areas, lower patch density, so big chunks of agricultural land in these areas, and not much difference in terms of edge or nearest neighbor. Now, we're going to move into the home range analysis, and for these, what we did is for each county we chose 3 random points to select a digital orthoquad, so 1 meter resolution aerial photo from 2014. Once we selected those digital orthoquads, we classified them into 3 categories, or sorry, 4 categories: woody, herbaceous, bare, and water. Now, for each one of these DOQQs, we generated 25 random points with a 17-meter radius buffer. That corresponds to an area of 15 hectares that was created around each point. We classified the images using those buffers, and we quantified landscape metrics that describe the structure for the habitat. Again, percent of land cover, mean patch area, sorry, there's a typo there, it should be mean patch area, largest patch index, patch density, edge density, and nearest neighbor distance between patches. what we found, and I'm going to focus essentially on the woody cover here. Louisiana is a bit of a different area here, and we separated it at the home range analysis because the numbers were completely different for that particular area, and I'll get back to that. If you look at the stable sites, you will see that in general the stable sites have a higher percent of woody cover, around 20-25%. Very low mean patch area, that means a lot of small patches. The largest patch index is lower than the mean patch area, which means patches are small. There is a lot of variety of patches. Patch density is high, which means a lot of small patches that add up to about 30%, and the edge density. These small patches have a lot of edge. They are complex patches. They have a lot of edge, and so we have lots of small, complex patches, which is quite good for bobwhite habitat. And the distance between these patches is smaller in stable sites than in declining sites. So there is this landscape structure at the home range that is quite important in terms of that management at that particular scale. The herbaceous also, it's a bit different because the imagery was classified in 2014, and what we found is that it would be better to put the herbaceous and the bear together, because if you have a good year of rain, that bear is going to be herbaceous. And if you have a very dry year, chances are that a lot of that herbaceous will show as bare. So we thought it would be just easier to focus on the amount of woody cover. Finally, we prepared some, or we analyzed and we did some projections looking at the impervious surface. EPA published a number of scenarios for impervious surface between now and the end of the century in 10-year intervals. And so what we used is data from 2010, and we combined it with the abundance of the models of abundance of bobwhite for 2010. And what's really interesting is that the first probably 5–6% of impervious surface are the ones that will have an important effect on northern bobwhite abundance. After that, doesn't really matter much. So what's really interesting is that with that idea, we were able to come with a relationship to explain how impervious surface will have an impact for the next 50 years. We projected the data through 2050. And so based on that, we did the region-wide analysis. And so you look at the BBS data in 2010, 2020, 2030, 2040, and 2050. And you can see again that central area of Texas where that Houston, San Antonio, Dallas triangle is, and you can see that in 2010 you have a smooth kind of connected surface that can go from north to south, and that is potentially going to be broken by 2020, and higher and higher levels of fragmentation happening all the way to 2050. Throughout the study area, we found that this relationship, what's really interesting is that although it's a few numbers, you can see that the regression is pretty consistent, and then the decline is there between 2020 and 2050. This is for Oklahoma. Chose two areas in Oklahoma, Oklahoma City, around Oklahoma City and Tulsa. You can see that the regressions show again another decline. This is the Texas Triangle, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and the San Marcos corridor. You can see again declines there. And South Texas, you have the Rio Grande Valley that's kind of stable if you compare that to the other points. And then you have the Rio Grande Valley where you can see some more sharp declines. And finally, Louisiana, we have Lafayette, New Orleans, and Shreveport, and you can see that there are some declines there. In areas like Shreveport, there might not be much to go and look for in the next 30 years or so. So that's kind of the multi-scale picture that we have. At large scale, population growth, land cover, agricultural practices are the ones that are going to be driving the abundance of Northern Bobwhites. At the county level data, the roads, amount of woodland is going to be quite important. And then at the more home range, at the pasture scale, things like vegetation structure are going to be important to maintain abundance of Northern Bobwhite populations. So this is really interesting because it provides a hierarchical structure. There are questions that are going to be asked at the region-wide. You know, it's going to be, so what are the trends in the next 50 years? We can talk about those. What are the policies that are influencing the whole area? And with this wide region-wide analysis, we can provide some information on how those things are going to be affecting Northern Bobwhite abundance. Same at the county scale, this can provide some very useful information for local policies, for local strategies, to inform stakeholders, cooperatives, and kind of lay a plan on how things need to be happening in the future. And then, obviously, at the pasture scale, those are the questions that ranchers and stakeholders are going to ask. How do I manage my landscape to increase Bobwhite numbers? So all of those are connected across scales. They are not independent scales, and that's why that continuum that Whitley presented is pretty interesting. Having said that, this whole study could be used as an interesting base to develop a framework for habitat management, both at the local, at the regional, and scales. And combining with all this information with socioeconomic data, this could be a very workable landscape design framework, not just for Bobwhites, but for other species that could be of interest for management. Okay. So with that, I'd like to thank again the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative for the funding and for everyone who's worked, our grad students, Catherine Miller, and the people at College Station. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you for the time and opportunity to do this. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that, you know, despite some administrative delays on our end in getting the position approved, and got a little bit of a late start, and Catherine left a little bit early to take a really nice job in California, I think it's important to note that all of this work that you saw here today was accomplished in a little over 6 months, which is kind of like almost doing a dissertation, and definitely a master's thesis, or perhaps even a dissertation if you look at each of these 3 scales being a separate chapter. But doing it in 6 months is pretty remarkable on the part of Catherine and Umberto and the other collaborators.
Well, thank you all for being able to present to us today. I have a question, and I'm going to open it up for other questions. So the associations that you've presented to us today aren't really surprising necessarily. However, the projections of population decline and distribution are certainly sobering, especially given the enormous interest and coordinated effort across Bobwhite range. Given that, how might we as a conservation community use the data and the new understanding here going forward as we desire to at least stabilize the population?
Oh, I'm supposed to answer that?
What? Yeah, that's a question.
Oh, I mean, I think you know, seeing the range from South and North Texas being projected to be separated or disassociated, like you say, Ben, is sobering. Making those presentation to key policymakers and other stakeholders, I think, is absolutely crucial to trying to, and we can't reverse the decline, at least stop it and stabilize it. What were you thinking, Umberto?
Well, I think the information that was provided here is quite useful to kind of address a number of questions at different scales. As Lenny said, you know, there'll be policymakers and there'll be stakeholders, and sometimes those questions might be slightly different. So policymakers will be more interested in questions that are going to pertain counties and regions and how they can address that to ensure that these trends can be changed, and stakeholders like ranchers and ranch cooperatives and conservation cooperatives might be more interested in how you do it on the day-to-day basis through management of pastures, changes in practices, things like that can help kind of reduce those trends. I hope we answered your question, Ben.
Yeah, and perhaps if others listening in have any other thoughts on how this information might influence decision making on the ground, or at least shape discussions going forward. I'm going to open it up for other questions. If you'd like to contribute, if you have a question, I suggest you hit *6. Do we have any questions?
People may need to press *6 to unmute themselves.
Pretty tough crowd today, I guess.
Ben, I see a question that someone wrote into us that I can read.
Please.
It says, this is from Dawn Johnson. She says that approximate 5% impervious cover and the huge species decline is pretty dramatic. It has significant implications for conserving habitat for bobwhite. Will this influence what the GCP prioritizes as conservation areas and strategies?
Sounds like a question for the GCP people.
Yeah.
I'd say, you know, let's think hard and long about how we're putting in strip malls and parking lots willy-nilly all over the place.
Yeah, I guess the sobering piece of information is largely when impervious surface goes in, folks in the conservation community have very little input into those decisions. And so the challenge is what sort of information can we get out to influence decisions like that? And to a large extent, I think we're pretty much at the whim of development.
Absolutely.
I think and this is Bill Bardish with the Gulf Coast Prairie, I think on the optimistic side, I think information like this gives us the ability to be proactive and offer options for avoidance, because you're right, you know, we tend not to associate and include in our conservation planning those agencies and organizations that are really the main impact. And information like this for a species that has a wide interest will help us at least offer the concerns to avoid or mitigate at some point landscape if that's a wish of the stakeholders involved in the planning process. So that's it's something you can do when you have facts and figures and a clear representation of what that does. And I think that's where we applaud this type of information to add to our portfolio of facts.
I have a couple of more questions here. Robert Perez asks the question, what defines the woodland patch? Does it capture savanna?
The woodland patch, we got, well, so the information that we got, a woodland patch is wood, and it could be in a savanna. It's slightly different from the traditional way of mapping, where you map a woodland savanna and you kind of delineate, and you'll have patches of wood and patches of savanna to make that woodland savanna. In our case, woodland is the patch, that part of woody vegetation that's going to be in that woodland savanna. I guess the difference is, rather than doing a vegetation unit mapping, we did a vegetation structure mapping where we separated, woody areas versus non-woody areas. So to answer that, the woodland patch is going to be the wood area of a unit that would be a woodland savanna kind of thing. Hope I answered that question.
This other question is sort of related, so you may have already kind of answered it, but Jim Giacomo says, how can this model take into account savanna habitats, something between herb and woody, herbaceous and woody?
Could you repeat that last question, please?
He said, how can this model take into account savanna habitats? And then he's just kind of suggesting or asking a question such as something between herbaceous and woody.
Okay. So when we did the sampling, what we do is that buffer, we analyze the structure of that vegetation. So as you can see, the areas that were stable would have about 30% woody vegetation. The rest would be herbaceous. And if it was an urban area, for example, we would have classified that as urban. But again, in that particular area, we classified. So we classified woody and herbaceous and bare and so forth. And what we did is, if you have about 30% woody, small patches, kind of lots of them, a well interspersed kind of landscape, that would be a description of a rangeland, a pasture, or a savanna that has both the herbaceous and the woodland. Does it make sense?
Well, what the approach you've taken, or we've taken here, Umberto, with respect to savannas, is that you're actually analyzing the structure of the savanna, not the overall extent of the savanna vegetation type on the landscape.
Yep.
Does that capture it? Because you're separating the herbaceous component of the open herbaceous component of the savanna from the woody structural component of the savanna.
And then you kind of analyze the woody cover based on that buffer area that would represent somehow the area of a home range. And what you want to do is see whether that area represents what would be habitat for Northern Bobwhite.
Correct.
It would be something around 25–30% woody cover, well interspersed small soft trees. And the numbers that we just showed are those that describe that approach. So you have small patches of trees that are distributed across the landscape. That's why the high mean patch, the small mean patch area, the higher patch density, and hopefully a lot of edge, which is good for bobwhite habitat. I hope we have answered that question.
Well, one more point on this too is that the approach we took, I don't know if you want to necessarily call it a compromise, but we had to break things down in the way that we did because as important as savanna especially things like post oak savanna habitat, are to bobwhite, they only exist in a limited area of the geography that we're covering. And so we basically had to break things down into those very basic structural elements rather than looking at things in ecoregions. You know, maybe a follow-on study that looked at habitat fragmentation by ecological regions, you know, which post oak savanna, maybe blackland prairie would be one subset. Yeah. Might be another way to do it, but it was just not possible with the three-state scale that we did.
There are a couple more questions that have come in. Robert Perez asked again, do you think that these results could help guide decisions at the county level scale regarding the number of patches providing habitat that are needed to support a stable population and how this would be related to patch size?
I think it's a two-scale question. So one is probably at the county level, what kind of what kind of policy should be implemented at the county to help stakeholders develop that conservation strategy, and that could come as recommendations at pasture or ranch scale, going and saying, you know, good bobwhite habitat in this county could be considered in areas that will have this kind of patchiness, these open areas. Probably also looking at some of the agricultural practices in terms of pastures, going back to native species, restoring some of those improved pastures and taking them back to native species, maybe thinking about how development is going to affect the county. It's quite a complex set of decisions there that the county will have to take into consideration, but at least there is some information on how some of the agricultural questions can be tackled there.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, if people listen. If we can push it out to them and then they pay attention to the implications of the results.
Okay, this is Ben Kaler again. I wanted to make an announcement before we get to the top of the hour, in that on Wednesday, October 5th at noon, Dr. James Martin from the University of Georgia is going to be presenting results of a similar study on habitat fragmentation in Northern Bobwhite with an emphasis on oil and gas development. So for those on the phone who have interest in hearing about that, to circle back the first Wednesday of October at noon. But I also wanted to ask a question of the PIs again, and that, you know, many of the folks on the phone may benefit from having these results in hand in a form that is approachable or easy to digest. So can you let us on the phone know when results from this might be ready for distribution and uptake?
Should be later next month. We're aiming for the end of October, Ben, to get the final draft pushed out.
Well, great. Glad to hear that. All right, are there, Greg, do we have any other questions in the queue?
Well, I think this last one might have just been answered, because Chuck Kowalski said, could you create a series of bullet points that boils down your finding, such as Umberto just discussed? And that was after the question about savanna habitats and really everything, I think. So just similar to what you were just saying, they're asking for a boiled down version of everything that you presented today.
Yeah, I think that's very informative. All right, folks. Well, daylight's burning. It's almost 1 o'clock. I thank everyone for your availability to listen in on the presentation today. Certainly, I'm thankful for both Dr. Proto Valdivieso and Dr. Brennan for being able to present to us today the findings of this, and look forward to seeing the final report and getting those out to the folks on the line and others. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for for going through the effort of doing my last name in the right way. That was perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
We just call him Dr. Parado. Leave it at that.
They have shortened it here.
Yeah.
So.
And thanks for your support for this project.
No problem. All right, take care, guys.
All right, thank you.